Welcome, everybody. I will wait a few seconds to enable everybody to join in because we have many registrations and participants today on this webinar. So welcome to everyone joining us from all parts of the world for this webinar on integrating human rights into development. My name is Axel Marx. I'm from the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies of the University of Leuven, and we are hosting the webinar today. The webinar today will present a new report by the World Bank Global Forum on Law, Justice and Development on integrating human rights into development, law, policy and practice. And it brings together several eminent speakers on the topic from different perspectives of thinking about human rights and development cooperation. The report aims to bring together the key political and policy developments over the recent years with a discussion of the approaches and experiences of bilateral and multilateral agencies engaged in integrating human rights in their development cooperation activities. They do that in various ways. And the report seeks to bolster our understanding of the nexus between development and human rights through a systematic consideration of different donor approaches. It also seeks to enhance our understanding among donors on how to work more collectively to advance the strategic and coherent integration of human rights in development cooperation, an issue which has now been on the policy agenda for a couple of decades. The report has a very strong focus on the concept of a human rights-based approach to development, which several donors are now applying for several years. We will go deeper into the report, and several experts will offer their reflections on the importance of the topic and the lessons learned from a practitioner's perspective. It promises to become a very interesting webinar with many participants from many different countries. We have more than 180 registrations for this webinar. We want to organize this webinar also in an interactive way. So if you have any questions, feel free to feed them into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And at the end of the webinar, we will try to feed in some of the questions you have. Very briefly on the context and the organization of the webinar. The webinar is an organization of the Working Group on Human Rights and Sustainable Development of the World Bank's Global Forum on Law, Justice and Development. The working group, which has now been active for many years, explores the legal, policy and operational links between human rights and sustainable development, with a focus on the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 16 in particular. The working group is coordinated by the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, the World Bank Human Rights Inclusion and Empowerment Umbrella Program, the World Bank Legal Vice Presidency, and the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies of the University of Leuven. Through a series of activities, such as a webinar today, we aim to share knowledge, create knowledge on a series of topics related to the broad theme of the human rights-based approach to development cooperation. And the report presented today constitutes a great achievement in this effort to disseminate that knowledge. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the structure of the webinar and the speakers of today. The report we present today was made possible through a grant of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Elena Flanagan will first contextualize the importance of the topic of the report and why the French government puts this high on its international agenda. Elena is a policy officer in charge of the French Human Rights and Development Strategy at the Democratic Governance Mission of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Next, Dougie Sisek and Siobhan McInnery Langford will present the report. They have been very instrumental in bringing all the information, all the knowledge together in this very comprehensive report, and they will give some of the key highlights. Dugu is counsel at the World Bank Legal Vice Presidency, Environment and International Law Practice Group, and co-chair of the Working Group on Human Rights and Sustainable Development under the Global Forum. Siobhan is a human rights lawyer with expertise in EU and international human rights law. She's the head of unit of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. And from 2002 to 2023, she worked at the World Bank. And if I can say, she was very important and instrumental in setting up all the activities we have been doing over the last couple of years. After the presentation, Anna-Mari Tornikowski and Margot Igland-Scarpete will offer their reflections on the report and especially also on the achievements and challenges related to integrating human rights in development cooperation. Anna-Mari is a senior advisor on human rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, serving both the political and development policy departments. Over the past 20 years, she has worked on human rights and democratic governance for intergovernmental, private, and civil society organizations in Europe and Asia. Margot is program manager for the World Bank Human Rights Inclusion and Empowerment Umbrella Trust Fund. Since 1996, she has worked on human rights and human rights-based approaches to development in academia, diplomacy, development agencies, and human rights organizations. So we have a stellar lineup of speakers. We look very much forward to all the contributions. Don't forget, if you have questions, feed them into the Q&A. And it's now my great pleasure to give Elena the floor.
Thank you very much, Axel. I first wanted to thank the World Bank Global Forum on Law, Justice and Development and the University of Leuven for the organization of this webinar and for bringing us together to talk about a very important topic that is really at the heart of France's development policy priorities, which is the integration of human rights into development cooperation. As an active member of the working group on human rights and development of the Global Forum of the World Bank, France has financed and supported the writing of this report. So I'm very happy to be here today at this virtual launch event and to share with you also the reason behind our very strong support for the publication of this document. The promotion and protection of human rights is at the heart of French foreign policy priorities and France's development policy. It has been reaffirmed as an objective and a priority in the 2021 law on inclusive development and during our latest Presidential Development Committee in 2023. France's engagement for human rights and development is in line, of course, with European priorities set out by the new European Consensus of 2017. And it's also in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, within which 92% of the SDG targets have their source in a binding international treaty relating to human rights. So to set the framework for the protection and promotion of human rights through development cooperation, France has adopted an innovative strategy on human rights and development in December 2018, which is really the first of its kind in France. It formalizes France's commitment to integrate a human rights-based approach to development in all sectors of French aid, and it develops a clear action plan for its integration. So this approach introduces really a methodological evolution in France's operational guidelines relating to development cooperation. It guides the development, the implementation, the evaluation of France's development programs and policies, because rights are a means to achieve sustainable development. It highlights two objectives: first, to do no harm, and second, to produce maximum positive effects on the realization of human rights through the implementation of principles such as participation, equal access to information, transparency, accountability, etc. It applies to policies that are carried out by the French Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs, but also to actions implemented by France's development operators, such as the French Development Agency. So France's strategy has an operational objective. It's accompanied by a concrete action plan that runs from 2020 to 2024, and that should also be renewed in 2025. It focuses on 4 priority areas with the dual objective of deploying the human rights-based approach across all sectors of French development cooperation. And it aims at carrying out specific actions to promote human rights through development cooperation. So the first priority is to support education on human rights and the promotion of the link between sustainable development and human rights. The second is to accompany development actors and stakeholders in the integration and implementation of a human rights-based approach. The third priority is to support human rights defenders in a context of shrinking civic space. And the fourth priority is to support the effective process of the Universal Periodic Review and the implementation of its recommendations. So within this framework, France has done a lot to push for the integration of a human rights-based approach into development policy and programming. It has set several priorities in this regard. Let me give you a few examples of what has been done. First, a lot has been done in terms of training of public development actors from the ministry, but also from the French Development Agency. AFD has notably developed an online training tool for agents of the development agency. We have also worked towards developing technical documents to communicate on the human rights-based approach and develop guidelines or best practices on how to better integrate it. The ministry has developed a guide for government staff, and AFD has notably developed technical sector-specific documents on justice, youth, media, sexual and reproductive health, etc. We have also worked a lot on strengthening accountability mechanisms to better evaluate the integration of the human rights-based approach in bilateral aid and measure its impact. This is particularly important for us as there is today no standardized means to assess the degree to which development cooperation respects and furthers the realization of human rights, making it hard for us to measure progress or set targets or objectives. So France has been working on a human rights-based approach check, developed as part of a partnership between the French Development Agency and the Danish Institute for Human Rights, with valuable inputs from other governments and development agencies and the civil society as well. This check really proposes a methodology and a scoring system that follows the OECD DAC 3-tier system, and is really an interesting first step to a harmonized human rights-based approach marker. Fourthly, we also worked a lot towards strengthening our partnership with bilateral and multilateral partners, such as the European Commission or the World Bank. Our work within the working group on human rights and development has been towards that priority. We also participate actively in the partnership of the Human Rights Inclusion and Empowerment Trust Fund. And Margot is going to talk more about this later. It's really important for us to strengthen those partnerships and strengthen research on the impact of the human rights-based approach and promote at the international level best practices and what has been done on the integration of the human rights-based approach. So on a donor's perspective, on our perspective, this report will be very useful in many respects. First, really to get a clearer view on recent policy developments and approaches that have been adopted by multilateral and bilateral donors in this field. Second, to better understand how this translates concretely into programming and learn more about the tools that other donors developed to help them integrate human rights into development. And it's an opportunity for us to learn from them and share best practices. And third, it will help us, identify synergies and see how best we can work together to make sure ODA contributes fully to the realization of and the respect of human rights for all, because of course we have to continue doing more to integrate human rights into policies and programming at a global level, and effectively contribute to sustainable development. Our work, for example, on strengthening accountability mechanism is a good example on how essential it is to work together and collectively on this issue. So I'm very happy to be here today again, and thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina, for this introduction and also framing the broader context. Now I would like to go give the floor to Shilben and Duji to present some of the main aspects of the report.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Axel, and thank you, colleagues. I'd like to just open also by thanking you all for the work in putting together this webinar, but also crucially the support of the French government in ensuring that we had the resources to carry forward this study, also the support of the Global Forum and of the Trust Fund. It's a huge privilege to join you here, and a special personal pleasure given my long engagement with the working group and also with this project in particular. I thought I'd start by giving a little general framing on the genesis of the report, since, as we know, this is the 4th edition. It began as an OECD product through the work of the Human Rights Task Team in the mid-2000s, and became then a joint product of the World Bank and OECD, and now is a freestanding World Bank product. The first edition appeared in 2006, the second in 2013, and the third in 2016. So as you can imagine, over the course, the successive series of these editions, it's represented the work of a great many people, not just within the OECD DAC Human Rights Task Team and the World Bank Trust Fund, the World Bank Legal Department, but a host of contributors and stakeholders, CSOs, but especially donors. And once again, I'd like to recognize the crucial support we received in this edition from the French government. Maybe I'd reflect for a moment on why this work is unique. There are many ways, I think, in which it is unique, but in particular, I'd highlight two. First, the work is rooted in an extraordinary breadth and depth of contributions from bilateral and multilateral partners, inputs from academia, from CSOs and others, but also because it very deliberately, through these 4 editions, marks the evolution marks an important evolution since its inception in 2005, and tracks the highlights, the challenges and the opportunities of the interface between human rights and development over almost 20 years. It critically, if one watches that evolution and trajectory, shows a clear evolution in the discourse on human rights-based approach. A second way in which it's unique is that is how it confirms the range of approaches that exist. So an entire spectrum of approaches, from what we would call perhaps more neutral, more formalistic integration, through de facto policies that de facto cover human rights but don't do so explicitly, so an implicit approach, all the way through to full human rights-based approaches, some of which go into 2nd and 3rd generation in terms of policies, and that's particularly true of certain of the bilateral donors, including Nordic donors, as we'll hear shortly. I think the other way in which it's unique is that it charts all of those approaches without casting a value judgment. That was a very particular parameter which we had to respect as the bank, given the limited mandate that the bank has, and the fact that there is no human rights policy per se within the World Bank policies ecosystem. And so in that respect, it maintains a fairly neutral and descriptive stance throughout, which I think may increase its usefulness. It doesn't purport to advocate for any particular approach. It also shows how an agency or an international organization without a human rights policy can and even should engage in rights discourse without going outside the bounds of its legal mandate. Crucially, the report emphasizes the legal basis of engaging on human rights in the development space and anchoring that in international human rights law and human rights legal obligations, examining the normative content of policies, their operational implications, the importance of training and capacity building, and as Elena mentioned, underscoring the need to focus on measurement and on concrete outcomes, as well as the tools that are needed to facilitate that and the data that that relies upon. Laterally, in later editions, this one included, there was also an emphasis placed on human rights indicators and human rights due diligence. Once again, the cornerstone of accountability being how these things are monitored and the impact they have in practice. I think I'll close my remarks before handing over to Duigu with three key messages that I would draw from this edition in particular, but I think are perhaps true of all of the editions that precede it. First is the enduring and even increasing importance of human rights in the development context, particularly with emerging crises that have combined and increased sadly, over the course of these years. Second is that despite the varied approaches by donors in development policy, a convergence is evident in terms of the recognition of the importance of human rights, particularly in high-level statements and agendas. It's clear from this study that there is relevance of public international law frameworks to all aspects of sustainable development. Moreover, different approaches to human rights can and should coexist depending on the various distinct mandates and roles of partners and donors, their areas of comparative advantages, and the degree to which they can engage explicitly in human rights. Those are often different, and appropriately so, given the distribution of distinct roles across the international system. But what that means is also that partnerships are crucial, and Elena mentioned this too. Not every entity should be involved in every aspect of development or of human rights law and policy, but partnerships ensure that each can fulfill its role effectively to the maximum benefit of sustainable development goals. And then a third message would be that human rights are underpinned by legal obligations. This was a red thread running through this study, and it's very obvious. Human rights are unique because they bind and they apply in all realms, including sustainable development. And they're unique also in bringing with them legal obligations and legal accountability. In this study, you also see, because of the emphasis on legal obligations and on international human rights law, an emphasis on rights holders and duty bearers, and as I mentioned, therefore accountability. And a final point is that the study notes the relevance of public international law to all aspects of sustainable development, with a concomitant need for policy coherence and joined up thinking on the part of all actors. I'll close there and hand the floor to Duigu to describe in a bit more detail the content of the report. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Siobhan. And also briefly from me, it's a great honor to be here and having the chance to work on this report. And I'm grateful for Siobhan, who has led this initiative over the course of several years, and all the other colleagues and contributors, and those of you who may have a chance to already look into the report may have realized that we have a very long acknowledgement section, almost like 5 pages, and that is really because this study builds on the work of various others over the course of years, and we try to do the justice to this accumulated efforts and also integrate the recent challenges and experiences, as Siobhan highlighted. And very thanks to Axel also for hosting us, and other speakers who are here and the support that they provided for the finalization of this report. I'll try to give you a flavor of what we covered in the report and the themes that emerged and some of the lessons learned, a little bit also on the methodology of the report. So as Siobhan highlighted briefly, so there are various rationales integrating human rights into development. So in that sense, the report explored justifications that donors use when integrating human rights into development, and some of those could be intrinsic, so like morally or ethically grounded value of human rights. But also there could be instrumental rationales, because human rights may also be beneficial, and it may facilitate other kinds of desirable outcomes. And also finally, the legal rationales, because we should remember that human rights are also subject of legal obligations. Building on those, we also explored a range of donor approaches. And as Siobhan said again, some donors adopt more explicit human rights-based approaches, while others opt for more incremental explicit approaches, but some also have implicit approaches to human rights when they engage in various dimensions of development work. And in that sense, we explored some approaches that link to legal obligations, approaches that emphasize human rights principles at a more general level, and approaches that prioritize governance and mutual accountability. And this is not to suggest that those are all like separate grounds. They can also interlink in various other ways. Then we focused in the report on individual examples and see how these overarching approaches really helped operationalizing in practice at the more policy level. And we explored and we looked into policies of different kinds of agencies and donors, including ENS policies of IFIs, EU, OECD, policies of the UN agencies, including specialized agencies, funds and programs, bilateral donors and emerging donors. And while looking into that, obviously there are various sort of policy documents, including explicit policy documents on human rights, but also those like IFIs who integrate some of those aspects in their environmental and social policies, and sometimes broader public statements when such explicit policies don't exist. We also looked into how donors implement their policies through programming. And in that sense, there are various tools available, including human rights due diligence, human rights indicators, and then again, those could be more structural, process-oriented, or outcome indicators, training and learning programs, and as a unique tool, also universal periodic review. As you know, this is a tool under the Human Rights Council, and it involves periodic review of human rights records of all UN member states. And then we have a specific chapter which really draws lessons that form the core of the current evidence on the value of human rights. It highlights case studies, project and thematic programs. And there are various lessons that can be drawn from those case studies. And I will try to highlight just a few of them, given the time constraint we have. Maybe to start with, the intrinsic value of human rights offers development actors an explicit normative and analytical framework. And this is very important for so many reasons. Human rights offer comprehensive and coherent normative framework, and it builds on participation and transparency. And in a way, it makes it non-negotiable, consistent, and legitimate. So this is very important, I guess, to bear in mind. Operational human rights principles have also made it easier in practice to integrate human rights into development programming. In certain cases, we see that although there's no explicit human rights approach, principles deriving from human rights framework have been integrated into programs, as seen in the works of some of the IFIs. A word of caution on that, of course, there could be a downside of such strategies when, the line is blurred between the operational principles that are related to human rights from approaches that are grounded in human rights frameworks. And of course, in practice, it may also lead to certain inconsistencies in relation to approaches to human rights. Another point in terms of lessons learned, human rights can contribute to governance agenda. This is partly because they are conceptualized in terms of duty bearers and right holders, and this reinforces the importance of state versus citizen link. And in that sense, it calls for building the capacity of states to deliver on human rights commitments that they have undertaken, but also the capacity of citizens to claim their entitlements. And this basically worked not only between the state and citizen, but also studies show that human rights-based approaches enabled a broader focus on the relationship between duty bearers and right holders, including categories such as refugees, not just citizens, basically. And it helped us focus also on more marginalized groups. And then maybe another final point of lessons learned, the human rights can also enhance the design and impact of aid on the achievement of poverty reduction goals. This is because it really helps us understand the structural and root causes of poverty, and calls for a better understanding of the context and power relations, and focuses on equality and non-discrimination lens, and more marginalized individuals and groups. So the report has more depth, obviously, but with that, I think I'll leave it here to give more room for other speakers as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for really sketching out the broad lines and insights of the report. I've put a link to the report in the chat so everybody can have access to it. It's open access. It was also included in the invitation we sent around, and we really invite all of you to have a close look at the report and also reach out to us in case you have questions, comments, and so on. In the context of this report, we also thought it would be very interesting to have a perspective from donors, from practitioners, especially those who also have been working with the human rights-based approach for a very long time. And one of those donors is Finland, of course. And we, for that reason, invited Anna-Mari to actually also offer her reflection, especially a bit from the light of what have been some of the achievements of applying a human rights-based approach to development cooperation, but maybe also what she sees as some of the challenges related to implementing this approach. So Anna-Mari, we look very much forward to listening to you.
Thank you very much, Axel, and thank you for the invitation. So as it was already introduced, my name is Anna-Mari Tornikoski, and I work as a senior advisor on human rights at the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And I focus on development cooperation and the private sector, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, especially working for both the political and the development policy departments. And I've also had the privilege of working with Margot and colleagues at the HRIETF over the past few years. So thanks again for the invitations, and especially congratulations to the working group on this publication, which I think is very thorough, clear, and insightful. And the fact that the World Bank is publishing on human rights really demonstrates the willingness to learn and share from other agencies in these kind of important areas. So I'm sure this report will be a helpful resource to many practitioners working on human rights-based approaches in development. So thank you, and it's really a privilege to be here. So as was mentioned, I was asked to speak briefly about the Finnish perspective on the achievements and challenges related to HRBA. And well, I'm happily in a good position to do this, as just as last year, the implementation of Finland's HRBA to development cooperation and policy was subjected to an external and independent evaluation. So these are not just my opinions, but I have some more credible sources to quote on this. So I'll base my observations on this report to a degree. And you're welcome to also read this online. I can put it in the links afterwards. So let me start by some of the successes. So in Finland, the human rights-based approach has a long history, as Axel mentioned, and a strong basis, actually even through our constitution, which identifies advancing human rights as one of the objectives of Finland's participation in international cooperation. And our government program also states that the Finland's foreign and security policy is based on the rule of law, human rights, equality, and democracy. And indeed, based on this, and we are currently implementing the 2015 guidelines on HRBA, the evaluation has found that through this long-standing work, there's now widespread recognition that human rights principles provide an essential moral compass, in a sense, for our development cooperation. I think that's an important point to start off with. And it's a result really of a long-term and sustained effort. What else have we been good at? We've been especially good at developing rights holder capacities through civil society and funds for local cooperation, which are local funds provided by embassies and delegations abroad. And civil society organizations are important partners for Finland. And our international human rights policy also especially emphasizes the role and participation of civil society, especially human rights defenders. But this strength comes maybe not automatically, but there is also a weakness associated, which also Siobhan was referring to, in that it's been more difficult to reach duty bearers and really link the work to partner countries' legally binding human rights commitments in an explicit and informed manner. It's maybe done more implicitly, but I think there's more work to be done, and this seems to be in line with what you have found in your report. So something to work on together, perhaps. And clearly, areas where we have really focused in on, where we've been better resourced, where there's a strong correlation between our foreign and security policy aims and our development policy and cooperation, we've been able to make more progress. And this is especially true in terms of gender equality and the rights of persons with disabilities, which the partners who were interviewed for the report were identified as areas where Finland has brought particular added value. And this evaluation found this to have been particularly the case with multilateral partners who implement multi and bilateral projects. And I'll move ahead to the challenges, because I think I've already taken moving through my time. So what have been the challenges? Although we've been good at applying HRBA in a practical way, in the planning, there's variation in the implementation and monitoring. And this also something I think I could find resonating in your report, in the gap between the goal of integrating human rights and the knowledge and expertise to do it. So we've been invested in this area, but there's still, and all staff working on development cooperation are trained on HRBA, but there's always more to be done to make sure that we can really follow through and monitor. And actually, I think the report provides good insights to support this work. Your report also recommends a more systematic undertaking of human rights due diligence, including through human rights impact assessments and do no harm policies. And I think this is again an area which resonates with the findings of our evaluation. Our evaluation, for example, found that the growing role of private sector instruments highlights the capacities of funded companies in undertaking human rights due diligence, and calls for rigorous human rights assessments and do no harm analysis. And this is actually something we're working on. We're currently working to further integrate human rights assessment into our development cooperation risk analysis. And I'll say that this is an area close to my heart because I work on business and human rights. You reference in the report our collaboration with SHIFT to further integrate the UN guiding principles on business and human rights into support to private sector investments. And I will just mention that as part of this work, which is mentioned in the report, we are now publishing next month also for wider use our training on business and human rights for government officials, which includes a section on development cooperation. So I hope that this will be useful. I think I'm out of my time, but I think it's finally, I will just say that it's increasingly understood, it always has been development policy a part of our foreign and security policy. And this is something that's increasingly understood and integrated. And I think this is especially important from the perspective of human rights-based approaches. It's also the close links with trade policy, which I see daily in my work as I work with these different departments. And I see how important it is in practice for us to be able to work coherently across the different policy areas. I think we are making progress, and I think your report provides some insights on this, but the sharing of lessons and the work continues, and I look forward to being part of the conversation going forward. Once again, huge thanks and for congratulations on the report. Thank you.
you very much for your insights and also sharing with us a bit of the insight of the evaluation you had, because I think it's very important to learn lessons from all these applications and implementations on how to move the agenda forward. A very brief note, because I'm getting some questions from the audience, if the webinar will be made available online. And yes, we will make the webinar available online, and I will put in the chat the web link where the webinar will be made available online. Last but not least, it's my great pleasure now to give the floor to Margot, who has been also very instrumental in this report, initiating the report, the discussions on a human rights-based approach, and she's been involved in these discussions for many years. So we look very much forward to hearing from you, Margot.
Thank you so very much, and such a pleasure and honor to be here today on behalf of the Human Rights Inclusion and Empowerment Trust Fund of the World Bank, the HRE. I'm a keen reader and a proud contributor to this publication. So the Human Rights Trust Fund has co-funded the publication together with the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and our donors are France and Finland, whom you have already heard from, and then also Sweden, Germany, Canada, Iceland, Norway, the UK, and the Netherlands. So I wish to thank them as well for their generous contributions to this and to other human rights initiatives as well. The Human Rights Trust Fund team, including myself, have written and edited parts of this book in close collaboration with the editors, Siobhan and Duygu. You have already heard them as well. And I'm really thankful for this publication. I believe it's a useful tool to understand how human rights are integrated into development across organizations and agencies and governments. So funding publications like this is an important part of our mandate. Our objective is to enhance the understanding and application of human rights in World Bank operations and analytics. And this book is really useful for us, and I believe also for the rest of the international community, to get a clear picture and clear recommendation what works and what's challenging in this field. I would like to stress the recommendation to pursue international coherence and also to ensure that development policies and programs are consistent with their international human rights obligations. This can really help reduce fragmentations and siloing of human rights and development considerations. And we have seen many examples that it can promote respect for human rights standards in the context of development. I think also this book enhances understanding and consensus on why and how we need to work in practice and more strategically on the integration of human rights in development. I would like to mention 3 different ways that I see this added value. Firstly, it reviews the approaches of different development corporations, agencies, and look at their rationale for working on human rights. That's really inspirational. Secondly, it illustrates how aid agencies are working on human rights at the programming level, really concrete, country level. It draws lessons around the added value of human rights in that specific field. And last but not least, it addresses both new opportunities that we see now currently and conceptual and practical challenges to human rights. It's not easy. It takes time to work on human rights. We need to be patient. But I think by giving these examples of practical and theoretical approaches, this publication shows that there are many different ways to take human rights more systematically into account. And it does work. A big congratulations to the Human Rights and Sustainable Development Working Group, and huge thanks to everybody who has been involved in this important work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margot. And thank you very much for the compliments on the report. And it has been a great pleasure to work with you on it. We are getting a few questions through the chat. So given the limited time period, Elena, do you want to come in? No, I saw your hand raised. But maybe given the limited time frame, I would like to feed in some of the questions we are getting into the chat. And there are a couple of questions from the same person, actually already starting very practically on empowering people in Afghanistan to work on human rights. Women, activists, trying to really make a change. And the question is very practical, whether there are any available funds who would fund projects in Afghanistan, and maybe already directly maybe related to some representatives from the donor agencies to see what is available. It's not here to provide specific advice, but maybe you can already direct the person to some sources. I propose we're not going to directly answer this question, but if you have any sources, if you have any information, please share it with me, and then I will share it with the persons who are asking the question. But it's just illustrating also sometimes the real need to act, especially in areas of conflict and in very difficult circumstances, to make this work. We have one question, and it's more to the editors of the report, is whether you looked and analyzed approaches of integrating human rights in development in countries in war. If there's any specific focus or contribution on that. I don't know, Juji or Siobhan, if you want to respond to that.
Siobhan, were you going to come in? Go ahead,
Yeah,
please.
go ahead. Or just briefly, I mean, there wasn't a specific dedicated chapter on integrating human rights in conflict settings or in fragility, but it was, I think it was there as a sort of a sub-theme, because so many of the countries and even the case studies were from countries that either are in or have been in conflict and are considered, you know, fragile states or zones. I think that it may also have come up, if I recall, in terms of some of the voluntary initiatives that have come up governing the private sector, so voluntary principles on security and human rights. But there wasn't dedicated research on that in particular. And maybe Duigu, do you have, because we also did try and weave in, I think, the relevance of, again, in the spirit of the policy coherence point that Margot made, and the fragmentation point, which is also a red thread, I would say, another red thread through the document, is to try and highlight the importance of donors and partners being cognizant of and reflecting obligations from different bodies of international law. And there we thought about international humanitarian law, international refugee law, the law or emerging law, and policy on forced displacement. And so in that respect, I think you will see that it's woven in different parts. Maybe I'd turn it to Duigu though on this, because you also have specialized expertise in a number of these areas.
Thank you, Siobhan. Really, I mean, just to echo, you're right. It's kind of a cross-cutting theme that appears under like different sections. We don't have a dedicated section on that, but we do highlight the complex issues that may emerge in difficult contexts like FCV, fragility conflicts, so not just war, but other kind of fragility conflicts. Contexts. And I think we do also highlight some of the emerging UN practices and policy statements in terms of, you know, the added value of human rights in the context of peace building and addressing this kind of conflict-related issues.
And if I may, Axel, I just one of the things that Duigu said reminded me that I think in sort of more general terms, when we think about the some of the more instrumental rationales for integrating human rights into development, which Duigu had mentioned, there is definitely, we definitely discuss ways in which human rights-based approaches can both prevent situations of conflict becoming violent or deteriorating, and how human rights-based approaches can also be part of a response post-conflict. So that's definitely discussed in places, but as we said, it's not a dedicated chapter.
Thank you very much. We also have a question related to whether the report deals with questions related to the human rights of nomadic and traveler minority groups, such as the Roma people. Is there any specific focus on that?
once again, no, there's not an explicit focus on Roma. I think it's when we obviously the situation of Roma is a complex and varied one, but just thinking of it through an EU lens, which is where I currently, from the vantage point I currently have, this would be considered probably within, so an intra-EU issue rather than a development issue. I'm not saying it's strictly like that, it would strictly fall along those lines, but in terms of emphasis, I think it's a policy issue that's Roma inclusion and Roma equality is typically thought of as an intra-EU policy matter rather than development cooperation. So it didn't come up as far as I recall in the reviews that we did of EU policy, but I'd be interested if others have other perspectives on that.
And just to highlight, we also have the benefit of having Siobhan with us, and because she's also heading the unit which deals with that issue in particular as part of
Yes.
EU.
Thank you very much. Maybe a next question I would like to address to Anna-Mari and Elena, if possible. There's one question in the chat which asks, it's great to see that many donors were involved in the drafting of the study and the donor perspectives were included. The question is, did you also include the voices and the contributions of the recipients, the rights holders? And we did not really cover that in the report, I think, but maybe Anna-Mari and Elena, you can give a bit of a perspective from your side, because maybe that was covered in the evaluation which was conducted for Finland recently, and that there might be some insights in how the human rights-based approach is perceived by the rights holders. And I know, Elena, from the French ministry, there have been actually quite a few reports and focuses on how you really can engage stakeholders in this process, so that it's not only a top-down process, but as is intrinsic in the human rights-based approach, a process which is empowering people and is also including people. I don't know if you want to add some insights on that, on what you are learning from the recipient's perspective on this human rights-based approach. Anna-Mari, you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think well, you can find the evaluation reports online, and there are areas, of course, a lot of the our partner organizations and rights organizations representing rights holders or of rights holders were interviewed as part of the process. So that has been a very important element of it. There were also some case studies within the evaluation report, and the degree to which they were able to then maybe go and meet on a local level with some of the organizations, and I mean some of the individual rights holders. I'm not sure, but certainly the civil society organizations were widely interviewed, including organizations of rights holders.
Elena, you want to add something?
Yeah, Axel, thank you very much. Yeah, we maintain a close relationship with civil society for the implementation of the strategy, and the increasing partnership with civil society is very important. And there's been several activities or documents that have been created really with civil society to integrate their voice as well. There's also been, for example, a consultation of NGOs, French NGOs and local NGOs on the integration of the human rights-based approach, and training as well for, I think, civil society actors, and also, of course, participation and increasing the participation of rights holders is a big principle of the human rights-based approach, and a lot has been done on that specific principle on how to make sure rights holders participate in development projects. And there's been also technical documents. I can also send you the link, maybe Axel, to things that have been done in that respect, so that you can share with participants.
Thank you very much. We have many, many more questions. We will not be able to cover them all, but we will, because some questions are really to get more information, we will go over them all, and where we can, we will provide links to resources and others that you can follow up. Maybe one final question, Margot, we just addressed to one of the things you said, is that human rights take time, and you need to keep on working on basically making it work. But one of the members of the audience asks, how does it really work in situations where you have countries where there are rampant violations of human rights, which subscribe to human rights on paper, but there are on the ground very little things are happening? Should we have more stringent maybe approaches of trying to impose very strict conditionalities, or how should we go about with these countries? Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, thank you for that very important question. So the human rights obligations commit the international community. If the government is violating human rights, the international community has obligations to come in and assist, but to ensure the core obligations of human rights. So that is something the international community has to take seriously. And how to do that? It's extremely difficult, and we need them to be really cognizant of how we can also make harm by our actions if we are not fully aware of the complex context. So we need to take time to understand before we take any concrete action. But there are no magic bullet here, unfortunately. So I think taking time is key, and talking with as many stakeholders as possible, and having funding ready and working with the local community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I would like to thank our great panel very much for their insightful comments and contributions. Elena, Tugi, Shoban, Anna-Marie, Margot, thank you very much for joining us today on the webinar. We will follow up with the many questions we received during the webinar. As you could see in the chat, we will make the webinar available for those who were not able to attend today, so that it remains available for everyone. And maybe as a final closing element, we will do another webinar related to the activities of the Working Group on Human Rights and Sustainable Development in a couple of weeks, when we will do a presentation of a new book by Professor Ingrid Landau on human rights due diligence and labor governance, and that's also related to some of the activities we do. The webinar will take place on the 29th of March, but you can follow the announcements, which will be circulated soon through our mailing list. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we wish you a very nice evening.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Have a good rest of the day.
You too.
You too.